Hi, welcome back. We're going to return to Luke's Gospel. We left off in 2021 and we'd reached chapter 21, and we're going to go back to there and follow through towards the end of Luke as we prepare for Easter. The reading is Luke chapter 21, is the whole verse, which is very long. We'll see how we get on. As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. "Truly I tell you," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." "Teacher," they asked, "when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are about to take place?" He replied, "Watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name claiming, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not follow them. When you hear of wars and uprising, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, and pestilence in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to the synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. And so you will bear testimony to me. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents, brothers and sisters, relatives and friends. They will put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out. Let those in the country not enter the city, for this is the time of punishment, in fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against his people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." He told them this parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourselves and know that the summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life, and that day will close on you suddenly like a trap. For it will come on all those who live on the face of the whole earth. Be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man." When I decided to go back to Luke, I hadn't understood what passage we had stopped at. And so I reached this point with a little bit of fear and trepidation, because this is not an easy passage to look at, and certainly not in the context that we find ourselves. It's impossible to read about the fate of Jerusalem in Luke 21 and not think about Ukraine today, not think about Kyiv and the other cities that we are watching bombarded on the news. One of the reasons I'm especially fearful is the comment of punishment there on Jerusalem. And I would by no means equate the fate of Kyiv and Ukraine with what Jesus says about Jerusalem in that passage in Luke. But it does seem really apt, doesn't it, the context that we find ourselves in and the text that we read. But before we get there, I want to think a little bit about how the chapter begins. The last thing we heard about was Jesus and the teachers of the law. And there was obviously tension between them and trouble between them. Jesus was very critical of them. And now he watches people putting money into the offering for the temple, and he sees wealthy people put their money in, but then someone very poor puts all that she has in. And Jesus says that what she has done is of much greater value because she has given everything out of poverty to God, and yet those who are wealthy have not. They've given from their wealth. They probably have still much wealth left over. It warns us about our devotion to God and our complete dependence upon Him. Our great wealth, comparatively speaking, in this country means that we often rely on many other things before we need to rely upon God. And often it's not until all things become impossible, until we get seriously ill, until we fall on very hard times, until our mental health is greatly suffering or something beyond our control that we can't fix happens, then we recognise that dependence. But this woman who is in great poverty, probably greater poverty than we can imagine, if all of her wealth is in these 2 coins, she relies entirely on God and gives it all. What a challenge to us for our reliance upon the Lord. Because that's the reality. We can hide behind a buffer of wealth, of credit cards and insurances and loans and family members, but the reality is that we don't have control in this life. We're utterly dependent on God. The last few years have shown us that with COVID. Although there has been disparity between the rich and the poor, one of the great issues of COVID for those who are wealthy has been that they can't escape it easily. It's something beyond even their control. And then what's happening right now? Again, of course, wealth and power are involved. But for many of us, things are happening that we cannot control, and it brings anxiety. This is the time to rely entirely upon God. The passage goes on to describe what I find a difficult picture to untangle, because sometimes it sounds like it's the end of the world, and other times it sounds like it's the end of the temple and of Jerusalem. The linking of the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, along with stories from Jesus or prophecy from Jesus of the destruction or end of creation, may have a connection with Genesis and maybe the way that the ancient Hebrews looked at the world. I've completely missed this because I don't read Hebrew properly, or very little. But someone who really does understand that, a scholar that I was listening to, has pointed out that the description of creation may well be the description of the foundation of a temple. That the world is a temple in which God will inhabit, and His image will be borne by the human beings that He places there. He draws parallels with other ancient Near Eastern culture and how they understood the formation of temples. And he draws parallels with Genesis and the creation narrative. If that's the case, then it makes sense that when Jesus speaks of the destruction of the temple, there may be ambiguity about which temple he means. The Jerusalem temple was destroyed. However, Jesus describes these more ambiguous and more general terms of war and rumours of war and famine and earthquake, all of these natural disasters or human-made disasters. The reality is that all through human history, people have worried about these things. There have been wars and rumours of wars and destruction and natural disaster and famine and pestilence. Human life and all of creation often has seemed fragile. In fact, probably to our predecessors, the world seemed even more fragile, and life may have seemed even more fragile than we have understood it to be. Jesus tells us not to be afraid in these circumstances, not to be fooled by people who claim to come in his name or say that they know when the end will come. He speaks of security for God's people, which is hard to understand when we see many of God's people in terrible times right now in the Ukraine and other places. He speaks of God really somehow being over and in control of circumstances, which again brings large questions about what happens in the world. And he tells them to be careful, to be aware, not to be fooled, not to be afraid, but to be sober-minded. He says, don't react like the pagans around you. Don't go and get steaming or drunk or, don't run away into escapism. Be aware, watch carefully, but trust. Trust that all times are in God's hands. He says, when we see these things happening, when we are reminded of the fragility of creation, remember also that our redemption is at hand. When the time comes, when Christ returns, we should make sure that we are on his side, that we are ready to welcome him, because he is the source of our redemption. I ran out of memory card there. What I was saying is it reminds me of an even greater anxiety, an even greater fate than nuclear war. And that's the fate of not being with the Lord when he returns. We should be aware. We should be mindful and prayerful about the world that we live in and always conscious of the fragility of life and the need to bless this world and pray for it and honour God in it. But we should be ready and prepared for his return, whenever that may come. Jesus died for this world, and he will return to rule it. And ultimately, despite the nations raging against one another, despite invasions and illness and the terrible treatment of people, despite cataclysmic disasters, despite all the things that go on regularly across this globe and disturb us, the risen Lord is somehow still ruling. His kingdom is there and it's growing. It might be unseen, but it will be revealed. And this is what should concern us. Instead of being afraid of these terrible events around about us, which are fearful, we need to fix our eyes on the coming kingdom. Not to ignore this world, but to allow the coming kingdom to put everything into perspective. To work now for the glory of God in this world, but mindful of the next world, which will appear in his time, which is already appearing by his power. We live in fearful times. We see all kinds of omens and we read all kinds of rumours and we hear all kinds of things in the news and in podcasts and in video, wherever we are gleaning information, the world can be horrific. It can be scary. But it is not outside of God's knowledge or command. And so we entrust our current circumstances, the world's circumstances, to him, and we honour him as we wait for his return. And when he returns, we will be with him. We will find our heart's desire. The Prince of Peace, who will bring peace on the earth in his time. Amen.